What if the people sleeping in their vehicles aren't failures, but people who pushed themselves until there were no options left? You can feel that frustration and unease just by reading a few comments online. These aren't people who gave up. They still go to work every day. They still carry responsibilities. They still try to keep their lives in order. But rents rose too fast, options kept shrinking, and in a very short time, having a job no longer guaranteed having a place to go home to. What is unsettling isn't only the growing number of vans lining California's streets. It is the sense that this way of living is slowly becoming something society is willing to accept. And once that line is crossed, the question is no longer why they are living in vehicles, but who will be next. Welcome to Tax Hack Pro. Today, we are diving deep into the quiet crisis exploding across California, the rise of the working homeless, and the van life reality that is reshaping the American dream. At some point over the past few years, vans stopped standing out in California. They didn't disappear. They just blended in, parked along residential streets overnight, lined up near industrial zones, tucked behind grocery stores and office parks. At first, people noticed them. Then they stopped commenting. And that is when the shift really took hold. Living out of a vehicle is no longer a rare sight across California. It is showing up in big cities and smaller towns alike, along the coast and inland. What is different now isn't just the number of vans. It is the kind of people inside them. These aren't scenes pulled from the margins of society. Many of the people sleeping in these vehicles still wake up early, get dressed for work, and blend right back into daily life. If you pass them in line at a coffee shop, you wouldn't think twice. That is part of what makes this moment unsettling. Van living isn't arriving as a sudden crisis. It is arriving as an adjustment, a workaround, a quiet solution people are choosing when the usual path no longer holds. Housing didn't just become expensive, it became unreliable. Leases fell through, rent jumped faster than paychecks, requirements tightened, and somewhere along the way, the idea of sleeping in a vehicle shifted from unthinkable to temporary, then from temporary to necessary. Across California, people are making calculations they never expected to make, staying close to work versus commuting hours each day, holding on to a job versus taking on rent that leaves no room for error, paying most of a paycheck for housing versus keeping a little breathing room by living out of a van. None of these choices feel like wins. They feel like trade-offs people make when stability starts slipping but hasn't completely collapsed yet. Spend time observing how this works in practice, and a pattern emerges. Vans arrive late at night after neighborhoods quiet down, curtains go up, engines shut off quickly. There is an unspoken understanding about staying invisible. By morning, the streets look normal again. Cars move, people head to work, the vehicles are gone. What remains is the sense that a second version of the city exists after dark, one most people never really see. What is driving this expansion isn't a love for mobile living or a desire to opt out of society. It is the pressure to stay anchored in places where life still happens. Jobs, doctors, schools, family members, support networks. For many, leaving the area means unraveling everything else at once. Living in a vehicle becomes a way to hold the rest of life together, even if one piece has slipped out of reach. As this becomes more common, it starts reshaping everyday interactions. Neighbors notice unfamiliar vehicles parked overnight. Businesses quietly adjust, seeing the same faces using restrooms before work. Cities wrestle with how to respond without pushing people further out of sight. There is tension, but there is also recognition. The distance between them and us doesn't feel as wide as it used to. What is striking is how quickly people adapt to seeing this. Once something repeats often enough, it stops triggering alarm. Vans become part of the background. Conversations shift from "why is this happening" to "where are they allowed to park?" That shift matters because when a coping mechanism spreads without being questioned, it signals that the problem underneath is growing faster than the response to it. For many Californians watching this unfold, the discomfort isn't rooted in judgment. It is rooted in proximity, the realization that the people inside those vans don't look that different from anyone else, that they didn't fall overnight, that most of them didn't make one reckless decision. They simply ran out of room to absorb rising costs and shrinking options. Van living isn't exploding because people want less. It is expanding because more people are trying to avoid losing everything at once. And as that line continues to blur, the bigger question starts to surface. Not about why others are doing this, but about how thin the margin really is between having a place to sleep and having to improvise one. This shift didn't begin with people wanting a different lifestyle. It began with a quiet realization many Californians never expected to face. Doing everything right no longer guarantees a place to live. The middle class isn't being pulled into van living by curiosity or rebellion. They are being pushed there by pressure that builds slowly, then all at once. For years, stability followed a familiar formula. Get a job, pay rent, renew the lease, plan a little for the future. That formula is breaking down. Not dramatically, not with one single collapse, but through a series of tightening spaces. Rent increases that outpace income. Screening requirements that grow stricter even as availability shrinks. Deposits that demand thousands upfront. Each step narrows the margin for error until there is none left. What catches many people off guard is how fast the slide can happen. One lease renewal comes in higher than expected. A landlord decides to sell. A credit score dips after a medical bill or a short gap in work. None of these moments feel catastrophic on their own, but together they close doors. And once you are shut out of the rental market, getting back in is harder than most people realize. Having a steady income isn't always enough anymore. California's geography adds another layer of pressure. Jobs, hospitals, schools, and support systems are concentrated in areas where housing costs are highest. Moving farther away often means trading rent stress for commute exhaustion, hours on the road, higher gas costs, less time for family or health. For many middle-class workers, especially those in healthcare, education, and service jobs, distance isn't just inconvenient, it is unworkable. Living in a vehicle becomes a way to stay close enough to keep life functioning. There's also the issue few people like to talk about openly. Flexibility has vanished. A generation ago, missing one rent increase might mean downsizing or relocating within the same city. Now, options disappear quickly. Affordable units are snapped up instantly. Waiting lists stretch for months or years. Temporary arrangements turn permanent before anyone planned for it. A van at least offers control. You know where you will sleep tonight. You can move if you need to. That sense of predictability, even in discomfort, starts to matter. Middle-class families feel this squeeze differently than those already at the margins. They aren't eligible for many assistance programs. They often earn too much to qualify for help, but not enough to keep up. That in-between space is unforgiving. Savings drain faster than expected. Retirement plans are paused, emergency funds vanish, and once the cushion is gone, every decision carries more weight. A vehicle becomes a last line of defense against complete displacement. What turns this pressure into a breaking point is how invisible it feels. From the outside, nothing looks wrong. People are still working. Kids are still going to school. Bills are still being paid, at least for now. That invisibility makes it harder to ask for help and easier to slip into survival mode. Living in a van doesn't announce itself as failure. It presents itself as a temporary adjustment, even when everyone involved senses it might not be. This is why van living among the middle class spreads quietly, not through headlines, but through word of mouth, observation, and shared strategies. Which streets are tolerated overnight, which businesses don't call authorities, how to stay unnoticed. These aren't tips passed between outsiders. They are exchanged between people who once shared apartments, mortgages, and long-term plans. At its core, what is forcing the middle class into vehicles isn't just cost. It is compression. The compression of choices, time, and resilience. When housing becomes a high-stakes gamble instead of a foundation, people adapt in ways that protect what they still have left. A job, proximity, dignity, a sense of control, however fragile. And that is the unsettling part. Van living isn't the result of one bad decision. It is the outcome of a system where the space between stability and improvisation has grown dangerously thin. For many Californians watching this happen, the question isn't whether they understand why others are doing it. It is how close they might already be to making the same calculation themselves. Life inside a van doesn't begin with a sense of adventure or freedom. It begins with a routine that people are forced to learn, finding a place to park where they won't draw attention. When night falls, many don't drive home. They circle a few extra blocks, watching street lights, looking for areas that feel quiet, areas where a knock on the window at midnight is less likely. Once they stop, the engine goes off immediately. Curtains are pulled. No lights, no noise. Comfort isn't the goal. Staying unnoticed is. Inside the van, everything is reduced to the bare minimum. There is just enough room to lie down, sit up, and store a few essential items. Every night, seats are lowered into a bed. Belongings are pushed aside so there is space to turn over. There is no idea of "I'll deal with it tomorrow." If you don't organize things right away, you won't have room to sleep. Exhaustion doesn't give you a pass because even a little disorder can make the entire night miserable. Sleep in a van is never deep, not because it is cramped, but because you are always alert. A car passing by, footsteps on the sidewalk, headlights sweeping across the windows are enough to wake you. Some nights are quiet, others end with someone telling you to move along. No matter what happens, you sleep ready to get up and drive. Because this isn't a place you belong. It is only a place you are temporarily allowed to be. Mornings come earlier than they do for most people. The van has to leave before the neighborhood fully wakes up. Personal hygiene happens at a gym, a public restroom, or a coffee shop. Clothes are changed inside the vehicle, crouched low to avoid being seen. Then the workday begins like any other. You see coworkers, answer emails, do your job. No one knows where you slept the night before. The heaviest part of this life isn't the lack of comfort. It is having to exist in two different modes at once. During the day, you have to look stable. At night, you live cautiously and temporarily. There is nowhere to truly relax, no lasting sense of safety. And when van living stretches from weeks into months, it stops being a short-term fix and becomes a state of survival where the biggest question each day isn't about the future, but where you will park tonight so you can sleep without being disturbed. The impact of van living doesn't stop with the people sleeping inside the vehicles. It quietly reshapes daily life for everyone around them, often in ways that are easy to miss until they become impossible to ignore. This isn't just a housing issue happening on the margins. It is something that seeps into neighborhoods, workplaces, schools, and routines across California. For many communities, the change shows up subtly at first. Streets that used to empty at night now stay lined with parked vans until morning. Neighbors notice unfamiliar vehicles appearing and disappearing on a schedule that feels intentional. There is no chaos, no obvious disorder, just a lingering sense that something has shifted. People start locking doors earlier. Conversations happen in lowered voices, not because of fear, but because uncertainty has moved closer to home. At work, the impact is even harder to see. Coworkers sit side by side, sharing the same deadlines and meetings, but living very different realities once the day ends. Someone might be late, not because of traffic, but because they had to move their vehicle at 3 o'clock a.m. Another might avoid after-work gatherings because they need daylight to reset their sleeping space. Productivity doesn't collapse, but it strains. Fatigue shows up quietly, and stress follows it into every interaction. Families feel this pressure, too. Parents doing their best to shield children from instability carry a constant mental load. Planning becomes fragile. Doctor appointments, school schedules, and basic routines depend on access to parking, restrooms, and safe places to stop. Even when children aren't living in vehicles themselves, they feel the tension. The uncertainty leaks into conversations, into moods, into the way adults hesitate before making promises about the future. Local businesses adapt in ways they never expected. Restrooms become contested spaces. Parking lots turn into temporary shelters after closing hours. Owners face uncomfortable choices between compassion and compliance, often without clear guidance. This creates friction, not because people lack empathy, but because everyone is being asked to absorb stress that wasn't part of their role before. Public spaces change as well. Libraries, parks, and community centers see increased use from people looking for a place to rest, charge devices, or simply exist without being questioned. These spaces were designed for shared benefit, but the demand placed on them grows heavier when housing instability becomes widespread. The strain isn't dramatic, it is cumulative. What makes this impact especially difficult is how normalized it begins to feel. When van living becomes part of the background, people stop reacting and start adjusting. Expectations are quietly lowered. What once felt unacceptable becomes something people work around. That normalization doesn't solve the problem, it spreads it. For everyday Californians watching this unfold, the discomfort comes from recognition. The people affected don't look distant or disconnected. They look familiar. They share the same commutes, the same grocery stores, the same routines. The line between stability and improvisation no longer feels fixed. It feels thin. This is the hidden impact of van living. Not just visible vehicles, but invisible pressure. A steady erosion of certainty that touches people whether or not they ever sleep in a van themselves. And once that pressure becomes part of daily life, the question isn't whether it matters. It is how long a society can carry it before something gives. Calling what is happening in California a homelessness crisis doesn't fully capture the reality on the ground. That label suggests a problem confined to the edges of society, affecting people who have already fallen completely out of the system. What is unfolding now is different. It is broader, quieter, and far more unsettling because it is pulling in people who are still very much part of everyday life. Homelessness, as most people understand it, comes with visible markers. Shelters, encampments, outreach teams, emergency responses. Van living among the middle class doesn't fit neatly into that picture. These individuals often don't appear in official counts. They aren't lining up for beds or services. Many don't identify as homeless at all. They still have jobs, schedules, responsibilities, and routines. The only thing missing is a stable place to sleep. That distinction matters because it changes how the problem spreads. When people lose housing but keep everything else, they don't drop out of society. They adapt within it. vehicles become bedrooms, parking lots become neighborhoods, public spaces absorb functions they were never meant to carry. The crisis doesn't announce itself with collapse. It shows up as quiet improvisation repeated night after night. This is why framing the situation solely as homelessness misses the deeper issue. What is eroding isn't just housing access at the bottom, but the reliability of housing as a foundation for working people. When individuals with steady income can no longer count on remaining housed, the system that supports employment, healthcare, education, and community life begins to strain. Stability becomes conditional instead of assumed. There is also a psychological shift that comes with this kind of instability. People stop planning long-term and start managing day-to-day. Decisions are narrow. Risk tolerance disappears. The question becomes less about growth or progress and more about avoiding the next disruption. That mindset spreads quietly, influencing how families budget, how workers approach their jobs, and how communities interact with one another. Communities feel this shift, even if they can't immediately name it. Trust thins. Tension rises around parking, noise, and shared spaces. Compassion competes with fatigue. Local governments struggle to respond because traditional homelessness solutions don't apply cleanly to people who are technically employed and mobile. Enforcement pushes people around without solving the underlying problem. Accommodation raises concerns about normalization. Every option feels incomplete. What makes this moment especially significant is that it exposes how thin the margin of stability has become. The distance between having a home and having to improvise one is no longer measured in years or major failures. It is measured in lease renewals, rent hikes, medical bills, and credit checks. When that margin shrinks, more people live one disruption away from displacement, even if everything looks fine on the surface. This isn't just about those already sleeping in vehicles. It is about the growing number of Californians who recognize how easily they could be next. That recognition changes behavior. It changes how people vote, save, move, and think about their future in the state. It turns a social issue into a shared anxiety. So this isn't simply a homelessness crisis. It is a stability crisis, a signal that the systems meant to support working life are no longer aligned with the realities people face. And until that gap is acknowledged, the visible symptoms will keep multiplying. Not because people are choosing a different way to live, but because they are running out of ways to stay where they are. What is happening with van living in California isn't a passing trend. It is a signal of how people are being forced to adapt as stability becomes more fragile than ever. When working individuals who still contribute, still show up every day, and still try to live normal lives end up sleeping in vehicles, this story no longer sits at the margins of society. It reaches into questions of security, dignity, and the future millions are trying to hold on to. If you live in California, or if these changes are starting to feel familiar where you are, stay with Tax Hack Pro. Like and subscribe so we can continue breaking down what is quietly unfolding, understand it before it becomes the new normal, and help you stay informed as these shifts begin to affect everyday life for you and your family. Thank you for taking the time to watch the video until the end. If you found this content helpful, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our daily video updates. Now feel free to explore other exciting videos currently shown on your screen. Goodbye and see you on the next one.